Welcome back to the very final part of the Bible study of the book of Daniel for St Andrews. I am Father Ed, and this is session number 6, and this is my very own reflection on the book of Daniel. So I hope you enjoy. Really, I would recommend that you go back and listen to all the previous ones to get a full picture of what the book's all about. But these are my sort of closing reflections. The book of Daniel is a book brimming with theological significance, not to mention stories which we remember for life. It gives us phenomenally good historical information along with glimpses of Hebrew worship in ancient times. Focused around its namesake Daniel, who finds himself as a Jew serving in a foreign court. He represents a textbook example of how to remain faithful to your law, your God, in circumstances which are challenging, dangerous, and sometimes life-threatening. Daniel represents Israel in this situation, firstly, before foreign kings, and secondly, before God as a prophet and visionary. In human terms, we can take much from Daniel about how to manage the tension of political and religious loyalties, how to be a good citizen and faithful to local rule without losing one's identity as a child of God. For Jews today, it continues to be a key text in demonstrating what it means to live as part of the diaspora. For Christians also, it has a great deal to say about peacefully holding one's ground and sticking to Christian principles within a secular or religiously hostile environment. Indeed, Mahatma Gandhi expressed that Daniel was one of the greatest passive resistors that ever lived. It is also one of the first texts that seems to describe a Messiah, certainly the Son of Man, which is part of a comprehensive picture of humanity restored to its proper place in God's world, bearing the responsibility of government under God. And that is what Jesus associates himself with. The Son of Man, just as the Christ, does all this where other human beings could not, and therefore represents the saints of the Most High in heaven. For the Son of Man is equally at home on earth or in heaven. Daniel is also the first place in the Bible that we have reference to the resurrection with a concept of dual fate. Some raised to everlasting joy and some raised to everlasting torment. This then leads the way for texts we are perhaps more familiar with in the New Testament. Matthew 25:46. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. John 5:28-29. Do not be astonished at this, for the hour is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and will come out, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. But perhaps the most important aspect of this is that time works towards a goal and a climax and an end. And this is particularly relevant because it rejects the ancient Greek philosophical view of a cyclical nature to history, something I will return to shortly. There are so many elements I could reflect on, it's almost overwhelming. I can't cover them all, so I will pick out some of the key ones, and I will start by talking about authority. Of course, we have few kings in the world now, but that was what was known in the ancient world, and we might still look to our modern prime ministers or presidents to find comparable power. What does the book of Daniel have to say about kings? Well, the first and most important point is that God grants power to kings. God plants kings as one would plant a tree in a garden. And this is why Daniel is content to serve Gentile kings and to use his divinely given powers in the service of the state, because they are put there by God. Trees are planted to provide shade and nesting and nourishment, and all of that to the creatures of the garden. So a king is also planted to do the same for their subjects. They are to be the source of life for their people, bestowing the blessings of God to the lands in their care. And the problem is that kings forget that this is their function, their calling and their duty. They become self-serving, and perhaps the biggest danger to themselves and to society is that they start to think they are above the law, above everyone, and above God even. Kings should exemplify the responsibility and authority given to humanity at creation. Adam and then Eve together are given authority and responsibility over the land and the creatures, even having the opportunity to partake in the ordering of the world by naming the animals. Humanity becomes part of the solution to chaos, not the creators of it. So when Nebuchadnezzar forgets his core purpose, the responsibility and authority given at creation, he is failing to conform to the Adam pattern. In other words, the sin of the Garden of Eden is repeated in the pride of kings. Humans are given astonishing dignity in the book of Daniel. The shape of godly rule in the end is human. So kingship, human rule, need not be beastly. Indeed, it should certainly not be. That is why the thrones in heaven remain waiting and ready to be taken up by human ones. Authority should be humane. This is why we hear that the first beast is made to stand on two legs, and a human mind is given to it. This is also why Nebuchadnezzar sinks into a madness of believing he is an animal, only to be made to stand upright again, to rediscover his humanity. The point is that the high status of humanity can be corrupted into the worst kind of offence against God. Humans wield huge responsibility and power entrusted to us by God, a huge risk on God's behalf, but that is love, shown through the dignity God grants us. In this respect, I really don't think there is any determinism or predestination here. Rulers are not predetermined to behave in a beastly way, but rather human rulers so often unwittingly fall into a pattern of behaviour that leads to the policies depicted in the book of Daniel. Indeed, it's far more subtle in any case. Many of the rulers in the book of Daniel believe in their own minds that they are doing good, just and reasonable things in trying to create unity through state religion, for example, and likewise with Hellenization. This seeking unity in culture will no doubt have seemed like a rational and even civilized thing to do, but it unwittingly posed a threat to the lifestyle and faith of the Jews. Indeed, Darius, for example, doesn't seem to be a bad person, and yet he unwittingly falls into a trap of persecuting a number of his subjects, and his rule is susceptible to other human corruption. Of course, the book does not have as its source the positives of any of these rulers, but we certainly get more than a hint, I think, in the accounts of Nebuchadnezzar that his rule brought many positives to people under his rule, including those of Judea. But ancient kingship is perhaps a little more akin to the modern dictator than the democratically elected minister. We might think of Lord Acton's famous remark that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But I suppose we are more concerned in the book of Daniel as to why power is so easily corrupted. And I think the answer is one we can all still recognize from all kinds of people in our lives, managers, vicars sometimes, scout leaders, that become loose cannons, unable to let go or step aside or to be criticised. And then that goes right through to the leaders of nations who start as freedom fighters and end as oppressive and dangerous dictators. Power and fear go hand in hand. The lust for power is prompted by a semi-conscious realization of the insecurity of our existence. So humans make a habit of attempting to make themselves doubly secure, grasping after power and wealth, fame and position. But the more we attain and the higher we climb, the more insecure we often feel in that position, and the more terrible, of course, the fall could be. The more we attain, the more we are driven to attain more. So the dictator's rule will become harsher and crueler and more clutching. But we don't have to be dictators to see some of this danger in ourselves. We often feel when we succeed that this must be the making of tragedy, that it will all come crumbling down. There is an existential anxiety, I think, about all success. A quote I used in a sermon a while back, which I really like, but I wish I'd written down the author, so apologies to the author, says this: "It is because men have nothing bigger than themselves and their own world to worship and wonder at, nothing more certain than their own ideas by which to steer their destiny, nothing more inspiring than their own goodness to lead them to repentance, that life grows feverish and frustrated, and bad dreams become a matter of course and reality." We have this fascinating part of the story when Nebuchadnezzar finds sanity through faith. It's not often we see those two things placed together. He looks up towards God and as a result is able to find health of mind once more. And I think this is exactly because when we become the centre of our own world, with no one to question or check our ideas or power than ourselves, that we find ourselves in a form of madness. Indeed, discovering God and our dependence on God is usually more of a relief than it is a trauma. Nebuchadnezzar needs this relief to find complete contentment, satisfaction and peace of mind. His total autonomy and power is his dis-ease, and that is why Daniel is able to diagnose Nebuchadnezzar's dis-ease. So God, having planted the trees of authority, will intervene when the tree no longer functions as it should. God becomes the heavy-duty gardener who cuts the shrub right back, giving it a chance to grow again. Such is grace. There comes a point when the tree can no longer do this for itself. It cannot self-regulate. The kingdom that will prevail and will need no pruning is the kingdom that recognizes itself not as a human achievement, but as a gift from God. So unlike the beasts who are out of control, doing as they will, the one, like a son of man, presents themselves before God as any ruler should when adhering to the pattern of Adam, and waits for that kingly authority to be bestowed on them. Of course, for the Jews, it is the hope that Israel should be this kingdom. But in order for that to be the case, Israel has to stop looking to blame external powers, the ever-shifting kingdoms, the constant and varied invaders, and instead Israel must look at itself. It cannot inherit that kingdom until it has looked for the beastliness within itself. And that is why Daniel's vision of the future must involve a huge amount of introspection, confession, and penitence on behalf of the people. But there is a further reason why Israel must reflect on its own sins, and that is because God is in control and has decided not to intervene yet. Because this tribulation is partly a consequence of those sins, they are not free from blame, but also because there is opportunity to emerge stronger and better. The psalmists often talk of refining, and that's a theme which reappears in the New Testament. I don't think that God directly uses oppressive and sometimes violent kingdoms to teach Israel a lesson. The oppression and aggression is caused by no other than the kingdoms in question, and I've already said much about those kingdoms not living up to expectation. But rather there is within this struggle an opportunity for God and God's people to demonstrate their hesed, their loving faithfulness and loyalty. God will continue to show God's hesed, God's loyalty to Israel, but when Israel fails to demonstrate its loyalty to God by turning from its laws and ways, this frustrates God's attempts to intervene, and it delays that intervention. And this is why so much emphasis is placed on remaining faithful even in the face of persecution. There can be no compromise with values or patterns of life opposed to God, no matter what the consequences may be. Endurance is the answer, and Daniel is the supreme example of that endurance. The hero of Israel, the hero of endurance. Loyalty and obedience are the way in which faith and hope manifest themselves. Daniel is supremely faithful, and we discover in the very last sentence of the book that Daniel's reward will be to share in the redemption of the world through resurrection. We might also think of New Testament texts like Luke 22:28-30. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you, just as my Father has conferred on me, a kingdom, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So faith looks beyond the fires of persecution, even beyond death itself. Luke 12:32. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. But reassurance and comfort are important and help to endure, but wisdom and understanding are even more important, because there's not just a personal consequence to being unfaithful to God. God's rule would be an empty thing were it not for those who by their loyalty and faith show that they are above all willing to accept it. God's reputation depends on it, just as God's reputation depends on demonstrating God's own loyalty to God's people. But of course the question is, how long will the people have to endure? And that question will not leave us alone as we move through visions from the 4th century BC right through to the 2nd century BC and find that persecution and oppression have got worse. And then, as if to show that that pattern is far from over, indeed the worst may be yet to come, we have towards the very end the mention of the arrival of ships of Kittim. That is the Roman Empire. But rather than trying to predict the end, I think the book of Daniel points us towards something more relevant for its readers. God's faithfulness does not depend on a return from exile, but reveals itself in the exile itself. Indeed, we see deliverances all over the place, from the lion's den, from the fire, from hunger, and in this way, the physical miracles that are told to us are only demonstrations of much greater miracles going on under the surface, i.e. the miracle of God's unfailing love and deliverance. The perspective of the visions is from the midst of the persecution, with no obvious end in sight, so this is far more relevant and compelling. But now, of course, to address perhaps the thing we associate most with the book of Daniel, apocalypse, that end. Apocalyptic literature is concerned with the end times, usually through the revelation of a vision or a dream. It is God's revelation of mystery, that is, knowledge inaccessible by ordinary means. And this mystery is God's plan. Daniel is a sort of prototype apocalypse, with, of course, the book of Revelation, a much more sort of developed version. For example, here in Daniel we have no mention of that day, the day of judgment. Also, there is no mention of cosmological upheaval or of great natural disasters and cataclysmic events. There's no plagues, etc. But we do get the sense of a tribulation, of course, an all-time low, at which point God will intervene. This tribulation is the sign of the end times. An interesting element of all this is that much of the imagery of Daniel comes from all manner of ancient sources, and yet Israel, through the book of Daniel, demythologizes them, gives them very real historical facts, people and places. So we have the inclination to do likewise. And we have done likewise and spent a great deal of time demythologizing the strange imagery of Daniel and giving it historical significance and reference points. We've talked at length about the different kingdoms and rulers, and I have argued throughout that the message was first and foremost for the Jews of the 2nd century living under the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes. So is that it? Does this holy book summarize the history of that period from a divine and theological perspective, and that's that? Of course, fascinating in itself. But of course, what we all want to know is whether Daniel is only a contemporary message, or does it also predict a future for us also? Well, my answer is that it is both. It refers to the persecutions in the 2nd century, and it also refers to future persecutions and tribulation. The strange imagery refers to real situations, but more than one situation, and that is why I think it's offered in these symbolic images. Remember the way all the kingdoms of the 4th to 3rd century BC, so the 2nd century BC, are rolled into one great figure of many materials. The point, I believe, is that there is only one kind of human kingdom that we see again and again, and there is only one kind of kingdom which God intends and which in time will succeed against all others. It is not to say that history repeats itself. I don't think that is true at all. However, cyclical patterns within history and human behaviour are not without contribution to the truth. I have heard theological time described as something more like a spiral which works towards a climax, or indeed a nadir, in which we regularly skirt by the edge of the age, and yet God withholds judgment until the peak is reached. One scholar, H.S. Van Vig, gives this wonderfully vivid description. History moves on the border of chaos, like a track winding along a cliff. At one particular time, however, history will turn over the edge. So if we hold that image in mind, that skirting by or past the edge or the end, those are the periods of tribulation. So believing that we see the end in periods of tribulation may not mean that we are mistaken. The signs of the end are present in periods of history, but that doesn't necessarily mean the end will actually come. that date, I think, cannot be calculated by human hands. It is a mystery beyond humanity, and perhaps a mystery it would be far too dangerous to comprehend. So why is it necessary or hopeful in any sense to be offered visions of the future? Well, the answer is that it is not on its own, but Daniel is not just about the future, it is about seeing history from a different point of view. It speaks to people that are living in a particular situation with a particular experience of that situation. In this case, people under persecution who see themselves as the victims of beastly neighbouring powers, the losers, those disinherited and stripped of their identity. Daniel tells a very different story of a people who sin and pay the consequences, whose enemies are only permitted to do what they do by God, who will act when God wills, and is thus in full control. A people who look forward to victory and their full inheritance. A people strongly identified with the Archangel Michael, the Messiah, the covenant, and the unfailing, loving faithfulness and loyalty of God. So what appears to be undeniable truth historically and empirically is in fact only a fleeting experience. In Hebrews 11, verse 1, St. Paul suggests that, in a sense, that which is not seen and yet grasped in faith has a greater measure of reality and permanence than that which we see. This has huge implications for the way in which we can read Daniel. Unseen reality can challenge all appearances. Appearance is only transient, like the appearance that evil is flourishing. Empires may seem to envelop peoples, but they will come and go, and their destruction is inevitable. The abiding reality is God, God's self, and God is concerned with this world. I hope you've enjoyed my closing reflection. I hope you've enjoyed the whole course. I know I have, just reacquainting myself with this absolutely fantastic book, one that deserves reading and rereading many, many, many times. God bless you all. Bye bye now. Bye.